When the freeze finally took her baby's last breath in the dark of that Wisconsin cabin, Ingeborg Halvorsen swore a silent, desperate vow. She would either conquer the winter wind, or she would let it bury her too. Ingeborg was not a woman who feared the hard work of the frontier, but she had learned, in the most brutal way imaginable, that the standard log cabins everyone praised were little more than beautifully constructed draft traps. It was the winter of 1878, when her world had fallen apart. She and her late husband had built what everyone in their settlement called a proper cabin: thick logs, packed earth, and a massive brick fireplace that devoured firewood like a hungry beast. Yet, when the mercury plummeted below zero and the relentless winds scoured the valley, that fireplace had betrayed them. It pulled the warm air up the chimney, drawing icy drafts through the floorboards and the corners of the walls to replace what was lost. They had burned 4 cords of wood in January alone, their hands raw and bleeding from the constant work of splitting logs, but it was never enough. One morning, in the quiet, freezing hours before dawn, Ingeborg had reached across the bed to check on her infant daughter, only to find her chest still and cold. Just 3 weeks later, the lung fever had taken her husband as well, leaving her alone with nothing but a hollow chest and a deep, burning resentment for the cold. She realized then that the traditional building methods everyone swore by were flawed. They focused on creating larger fires, but they did nothing to actually hold the heat where it mattered. So, in the late summer of 1883, after years of saving every penny from sewing and domestic labor, Ingeborg loaded her meager belongings onto a single, creaking wooden wagon. She did not seek a comfortable settlement in the south. Instead, she headed north into the vast, wind-scoured expanses of the Dakota Territory. The people she encountered along the trail shook their heads in silent pity when they saw a lone woman traveling with only 2 draft horses and a wagon of mismatched tools. They told her that the Dakota winters were different, drier, and far more relentless than anything she had faced in the east. They warned her of the whiteouts that could bury a house in a single afternoon, and the frost that could creep under doorframes to freeze water inside a kettle. But Ingeborg only listened with a quiet, polite nod, her eyes fixed on the northern horizon. She did not tell them about the tiny grave she had left behind in Wisconsin or the vow she carried in her heart. She was not looking for their approval. She was looking for a blank slate where she could build a sanctuary that would never betray her again. When she finally arrived at her claim, a flat, treeless stretch of prairie near the edge of the Popo-Aggie River, she looked out over the dry grass and felt a strange sense of peace. The land was beautiful in its emptiness, but it was also a warning. There were no trees to block the wind, no hills to offer shelter. If she was going to survive the winter that everyone promised was coming, she would have to build a cabin that could stand against the full fury of the plains. She spent her first 3 days sleeping under the wagon, listening to the grass rustling in the autumn breeze, her mind constantly turning over the designs she had spent years planning. She remembered her grandmother's old farmhouse in Telemark, Norway, a place that had stood for a century against the worst of the Nordic winters. She remembered how her grandmother had never complained of drafts, and how her bed had always been warm, even on mornings when the windows were coated in thick ice. The secret had not been a larger fireplace or more wood, but something far older and more patient. It was that memory, a fragment of traditional wisdom from a world her neighbors had forgotten, that she intended to build into the soil of the Dakota Territory. She knew the locals would not understand. To them, progress meant felling trees as quickly as possible and building rectangular pine boxes that looked like the homes they had left behind. But Ingeborg had seen those pine boxes fail. She had felt the icy air that scoured the floors while the rafters were hot enough to melt wax. She was done with that struggle. As she stood on the open prairie, feeling the sharp autumn wind pull at her woolen shawl, she knew that her survival depended on her willingness to stand alone. She would build her home, not with the pride of a modern builder, but with the quiet, stubborn patience of a woman who had already paid the highest price the winter could demand. She was ready to begin her work, and she did not care if the world called her crazy. Let them whisper at their gatherings. Let them watch from their distant claims. She had a design. She had the memory of her daughter, and she had the quiet, unyielding soil of Dakota beneath her feet. That would be more than enough to carry her through the coming storm. Her work started now. Ingeborg wasted no time in marking the footprint of her new life, but her first actions on the property left the neighboring homesteaders completely bewildered. Armed with a simple iron spade, several wooden pegs, and a ball of rough hemp twine, she began laying out the dimensions of her cabin in the dry, clay-rich dirt. The neighbors, who were already watching her with a mix of curiosity and pity, noticed the layout almost immediately. It was mid-October, and the autumn wind was beginning to carry the sharp scent of early frost. Most of the families in the area were busy reinforcing their own homes, cutting wood, and preparing for the winter. When they saw Ingeborg walking her boundaries, they expected to see a standard, respectable homestead layout. A typical cabin in this part of the territory was at least 24 feet long, divided into two deperio, and she measured a space that was barely 16 feet by 18 feet. It was a tiny, compact square that looked more like a storage shed or a temporary root cellar than a permanent home. Marta Vang, the local gossip who lived on the quarter section to the south, decided to walk over and investigate. She found Ingeborg digging a shallow trench along the twine line, her movements slow and deliberate. Marta stood at the edge of the claim, her hands tucked into her apron, and began asking questions. She asked where the bedrooms would be, where Ingeborg planned to put her guests, and how she expected to live in a single room without freezing. Ingeborg did not stop her digging. She simply looked up with a polite, tired smile and said that she did not need much space and that a smaller room was easier to keep warm. Marta was not satisfied with the answer. She walked back to the settlement and told everyone who would listen that the new widow was building a house with no bedroom at all. She said Ingeborg was planning to live like a wild animal, huddled on the dirt floor in a single, tiny room. The men at the trading post laughed when they heard the story. Jonas Lind, the settlement's master carpenter, shook his head and said that a cabin without a proper bedroom was not a home, it was a tomb. He predicted that the first hard freeze would drive her out, or worse, that she would suffocate from the smoke of a fire built too close to her living area. To them, her layout was a clear sign of inexperience and grief-induced madness. But Ingeborg had a methodical plan that none of them could see. She knew that every extra square foot of floor space was a liability in a winter storm. A larger room required more wood to heat, created more drafts, and allowed the warm air to escape to the rafters where it did no good. By keeping her living space small, she was reducing the volume of air she would have to warm. But she was not planning to sleep on the cold floor, nor was she planning to go without a bed. Her grandmother's house had taught her that the warmest place in a room was not near the fire, but inside the stove itself. She had designed her layout around a massive central stone wall that would serve as both her heater and her bedchamber. The twine in the mud showed a large rectangular block, occupying nearly a third of her tiny floor plan, positioned on the north side of the cabin. To the neighbors, it looked like she was building an oversized chimney that would crowd her out of her own house. They did not see the hidden chamber she had designed within the stone, or the double pine doors that would seal her inside a pocket of constant radiant warmth. Ingeborg continued her work, digging the trench down to solid clay, her hands growing calloused and her face weathered by the wind. She did not defend her blueprint. She did not explain her logic to Marta or Jonas or anyone else. She had spent too many nights shivering in a proper cabin to care about their definitions of a home. She knew that the Dakota winter would not care about tradition or pride. It would only care about physics. As she placed the first foundation pegs into the cold earth, she felt the first flake of snow touch her cheek. It was a warning, but she was ready. She would build her sanctuary, stone by stone, in the very middle of their laughter. While the rest of the settlement was busy felling pine trees and hauling fresh lumber from the sawmill, Ingeborg Halvorsen spent her mornings doing something that looked like absolute madness to everyone watching. Instead of preparing timber for her walls, she took her heavy wooden wagon and her 2 draft horses down to the dry, stony bed of the Popo-Aggie River. The autumn cold was deepening, and the water in the deeper pools had already begun to form a skin of ice. Ingeborg climbed down into the rocky bed, her boots slipping on the wet clay, and began selecting stones. She was not looking for light, easy-to-move rocks. She was looking for density, weight, and solid mass. She spent hours examining each stone, running her calloused fingers over the cold surfaces. She selected heavy river schist and dense, dark limestone, some of the blocks weighing 50 or 60 pounds each. These were the stones that most builders rejected because they were too heavy to haul and too irregular to stack without immense effort. But Ingeborg knew that density was the key to heat retention. A light, porous rock would lose its warmth within an hour, but these dense river stones would act like thermal batteries, holding the heat of a fire long after the flames had died to ash. She lifted each block by hand, her muscles straining and her breath rising in ragged white clouds in the frosty morning air. She loaded them into the wagon bed, one by one, until the wooden axle groaned under the weight of nearly 2 tons of stone. Jonas Lind rode past on his way to a lumber claim one morning and stopped to watch her. He leaned over his horse's saddle, shaking his head. He told her that she was wasting her strength, and that a woman alone could never haul enough stone to build anything useful. He warned her that she would break her wagon's axle or injure her horses before she even got the foundation laid. But Ingeborg only smiled politely, thanked him for his concern, and went back to lifting another heavy block of limestone. Jonas rode off, muttering to himself that she was too stubborn for her own good. By the time he reached the trading post, he had told everyone that the Norwegian widow was trying to build a stone fortress with her bare hands. The laughter in the settlement grew louder. They called her the rock hauler. They wondered if she was planning to live in a cave. But Ingeborg did not stop. Over the course of 3 weeks, she made more than a dozen trips to the riverbed, eventually hauling nearly 9,500 pounds of dense riverstone to her cabin site. Her hands were blistered and bleeding. Her back was constantly stiff, and her woolen kirtle was stained with gray clay and river mud. But as she looked at the massive mound of stone growing beside her foundation, she did not feel defeated. She felt a deep, quiet sense of accomplishment. Every stone she hauled was a shield. In her mind, she was not just moving rock, she was building a barrier between her life and the cold that had taken her daughter in Wisconsin. She remembered the freezing draft that had scoured the floor of her old home, and she knew that these heavy river stones would never let that happen again. She spent her evenings sorting the rocks by size and density, placing the heaviest, flattest limestone blocks in one pile for the base of her stove wall, and the dense schist in another for the interior lining of the firebox. She worked by the light of a small lantern, the prairie wind howling across the empty spaces around her. The neighbors watched her from their warm, traditional cabins, shook their heads, and congratulated themselves on their own common sense. They had their pine walls raised, their windows fitted, and their wood piles stacked high. They believed they were ready for the winter. But Ingeborg looked at her pile of stone and knew that she was the one who was truly preparing. She was building for the worst that the territory could throw at her, and she was doing it with the very bones of the earth. With her stones gathered, Ingeborg began the process of mixing her mortar, and once again, her methods left the local builders shaking their heads in disbelief. Instead of using the expensive imported lime that Jonas Lind and the other professional carpenters swore by, she set up a large wooden mixing trough beside her stone pile. She spent a full day hauling buckets of thick, gray-blue clay from the riverbank, then mixed it with 3 parts of coarse river sand she had sifted herself. But it was her final ingredient that truly convinced the neighbors she had lost her senses. She walked to the local livery stable and spent 2 hours collecting horsehair from the floor, then returned to her claim and began working the hair into her clay mixture with her bare hands. The sight of her kneading horsehair into gray mud was too much for Marta Vang to ignore. Marta stood by the fence line, her face pinched with disapproval, and asked why Ingeborg was putting animal hair into her walls. She warned her that the mud would rot, that the hair would smell of manure, and that the first heavy rain would wash the whole structure away. Ingeborg did not stop her kneading. She explained patiently that the horsehair acted as a binder, giving the clay mortar the elasticity it needed to expand and contract under intense heat without cracking. She said that lime mortar was too rigid, and that a wall heated from the inside would quickly fracture if the mortar could not flex. Marta only scoffed, telling her that mud was for swallows, not for human homes. She returned to the settlement and told everyone that the widow was plastering her chimney with horsehair and dirt. Jonas Lind stopped by the next afternoon, his professional pride insulted by her rejection of his building standards. He stood over her mixing trough, looking at the gray mortar, and told her flatly that her clay would crumble under the first hard freeze. He said that without proper lime, her stone wall would collapse under its own weight, crushing her in her sleep. He warned her that she was risking her life for the sake of a few dollars saved on proper materials. But Ingeborg knew that her grandmother's traditional Norwegian recipe had stood for a century against the Nordic cold. The clay mortar, slightly elastic and bound tight by the interlocking horsehair fibers, was far superior to rigid lime for a thermal mass wall. It would absorb the intense heat of her fires, expanding slightly as the stone warmed, and then contract as it cooled, without forming the tiny hairline cracks that allowed cold air to penetrate. She began laying the stones, starting with a foundation of massive limestone blocks sunk 4 feet deep into the ground. She laid the wall 20 inches thick, her movements slow and deliberate as she fitted each stone to its neighbor, filling the gaps with her handmade mortar. She built the firebox at the center of the wall, lining it with the densest schist she had quarried, creating a small, highly efficient combustion chamber. The flue did not run straight up the chimney like a standard fireplace. Instead, she designed a winding, horizontal channel that forced the hot gases to travel through the stone mass before exiting. This was the secret of heat extraction. The longer the hot air stayed inside the wall, the more warmth the stone would absorb. She worked through the late October cold, her fingers frozen, and her boots covered in gray clay. The wall rose slowly, a massive, dark pillar of stone dominating the small space of her cabin. The neighbors watched her through their windows, laughing at the widow and her mud wall, entirely unaware of the silent, efficient engine of heat she was building in the very heart of her home. The winter of 1883 was beginning to show its teeth by the time Ingeborg's cabin was ready for its roof, and the traditional cabin-raising custom brought the entire settlement together on her claim. It was the law of the frontier that neighbors helped neighbors build, regardless of what they thought of each other's sanity. Jonas Lind brought his timber tools. Marta Vang brought a pot of venison stew, and several other families arrived with wagons of split cedar shingles. They worked quickly, felling the last of the rafters and raising the roof beams over her tiny 16 by 18-foot frame. But the moment the men stepped inside to help with the interior rafters, the conversation went completely silent. They stood in the middle of her single, compact room, their hammers hanging at their sides, staring at the massive stone wall that dominated the northern face of the interior. The wall was 20 inches thick, running 11 feet wide and rising all the way to the roof joists, occupying nearly a third of her total floor space. There was no partition wall, no separate sleeping chamber, and no space left for a bed. The entire cabin was nothing more than a tiny, crowded shell built around a towering monument of river schist and limestone. Marta Vang walked the perimeter of the room, her boots echoing on the packed earth floor, and began counting the stones aloud. She turned to the other women, shaking her head in disbelief, and whispered that Ingeborg had turned 3 winters of firewood into useless rock. She asked where Ingeborg planned to put her dresser, her table, and most importantly, her bed. To Marta, the cabin was a disaster, a cramped, drafty box with no privacy and no common sense. The men were no less critical. They gathered around the massive stone firebox, touching the clay and horsehair mortar, and muttered that the whole thing looked like an oversized chimney that had swallowed the house. They asked why she had used so much stone on an interior wall that didn't even face the outside. Ingeborg did not argue with them. She served them coffee from her small copper kettle, thanked them for their labor, and went back to adjusting her stovepipe. She knew that they could only see what was missing. They saw a cabin with no bedroom, no separate sleeping chamber, and no comfort. They did not see the hidden chamber she had built into the eastern face of the stone wall, or the double pine doors that she had carefully mortised into the limestone. To them, her cabin was a failure before the roof was even finished. Jonas Lind stood in the center of the room, looking at the massive stove wall, and told her that she had made a terrible mistake. He said that the stone would hold the cold of the ground, and that without a separate bedroom to trap the heat, Her single room would be impossible to keep warm in a real Dakota blizzard. He predicted that she would spend her winter shivering on the dirt floor, trying to get warmth from a stone wall that would do nothing but bleed her fire's heat into the earth. Ingeborg only listened with a quiet, polite nod, her eyes reflecting the gray autumn sky through her small window. She did not tell Nels about her daughter's freezing death in Wisconsin, or how her husband had shivered to death in a proper cabin with a separate bedroom. She had built her home for survival, not for show, and she was willing to let the coming winter deliver the final verdict. With the roof raised and the shingles laid, Jonas Lind decided to conduct a final, professional inspection of the widow's cabin before the first real snow locked the valley down. He walked through the low doorway, his heavy boots thudding on her newly laid pine floorboards, and stood before the massive stone stove wall. His eyes fixed immediately on the set of double pine doors she had carefully mortised into the eastern face of the limestone. The doors were small, roughly 5 feet long and less than 2 feet wide, positioned about 40 inches above the floor level. To Jonas, they looked completely absurd. He asked her if she was planning to use the stone wall as a pantry, or if she was storing her flour inside her chimney. Ingeborg, who was busy arranging her small collection of pewter plates on a shelf, replied quietly that the doors were for her bedchamber. Jonas stared at her, his jaw tightening with a mix of disbelief and professional insult. He told her flatly that she was out of her mind. He said that sleeping inside a stone stove wall was not only undignified, but dangerous. He warned her that she would suffocate from the coal smoke, or that her clay mortar would fail under the heat, causing the massive limestone blocks to collapse and crush her in her sleep. Jonas had built cabins in these mountains for 15 years, and he had never heard of anyone sleeping inside a chimney. He declared her design a lethal mistake, a monument to grief-induced madness that would cost her life before February arrived. He urged her to let him tear down the wall and build her a proper, traditional log bedroom on the south side of the cabin. He said he would charge her nothing for the labor, out of respect for her late husband's memory, but Ingeborg refused. She thanked him for his generosity, but her voice was firm and unyielding. She said her stove wall would stand, and her bed would remain where she had built it. Jonas left the cabin in a huff, his pride wounded by her stubbornness. He rode back to the settlement and told everyone at the trading post that the widow's cabin was a death trap. He said she was planning to sleep inside her own fireplace, and that they would likely find her frozen or suffocated before the spring thaw. The neighbors shook their heads, their laughter turning to a kind of grim pity. Marta Vang announced that she would not be responsible for what happened to a woman who refused to listen to common sense. But Ingeborg remained completely unbothered by their judgment. She spent her evening fitting the pine doors with a simple, tight-fitting, lathed wooden latch she had carved herself. She lined the interior of the alcove, the chamber 64 inches long, 24 inches deep, and 42 inches high with several layers of thick wool and clean linen. When she closed the double pine doors, the space was nearly airtight, a tiny, insulated sanctuary surrounded on 3 sides by dense, heat-holding limestone. She lit a small test fire in the center firebox, watching the draft pull the smoke smoothly through the winding horizontal flue channels she had designed. The masonry began to warm, slowly absorbing the heat of the birch splits. She placed her hand against the eastern face of the wall, inside the alcove, and felt the first gentle warmth beginning to push through the stone. It was not the dry, aggressive heat of a metal stove. It was a soft, steady, radiant warmth that felt like a living thing. She closed the pine doors, blew out her lantern, and lay down in the dark. She knew that Jonas Lind's judgment was based on what he had been taught to build, but her grandmother's memory was based on what had kept people alive for centuries. She was ready for the winter. The winter of 1883 did not arrive with a gentle warning. It slammed into the Dakota Territory in the second week of December with the suddenness of a gunshot. A low-pressure system dropped out of Canada, bringing with it temperatures that crashed to 28 degrees below zero and winds that sustained at 35 miles per hour, pushing the wind chill down to 55 below. The storm was not a typical blizzard with heavy falling snow. It was an ice storm, a grinding, relentless front that drove icy needles horizontally across the flat prairie, finding every gap in every structure. In the settlement, the traditional cabins that Jonas Lind had built were put to the ultimate test, and they were failing. The pine logs, which looked so solid in the autumn sun, began to contract and pull apart in the extreme cold, creating tiny, invisible gaps in the chinking. The wind scoured the exterior walls, pulling the thermal energy out of the cabins faster than any fireplace could replace it. Families woke to find frost forming on the inside of their walls, and ice coating the blankets of their children. At the Lind household, Jonas woke every 2 hours to stoke his cast-iron box stove, but the heat rose uselessly to the rafters, leaving the floorboards at a freezing 28 degrees. His water bucket, placed only 6 feet from the fire, froze solid overnight. His family huddled together in the center of the main room, wrapped in layers of wool and buffalo hides, their breath rising in thick white clouds in the dim morning light. Marta Vang's cabin was even colder. Her stove was consuming firewood at a rate that terrified her husband, but the room never climbed above 38 degrees. Their seasoned firewood, stored under a canvas tarp that had been ripped away by the wind, was frozen and damp, hissing and smoking in the hearth instead of burning hot. The cold was a physical weight, a relentless pressure that scoured their pride and turned their daily lives into a desperate struggle for survival. But in Ingeborg Halvorsen's cabin, there was no panic. The blizzard howled against her north wall, but the 20-inch thick limestone and schist barrier stood unmoved. Inside, the air was still and warm, holding at a comfortable 62 degrees. She did not stoke her fire every 2 hours. She did not wake up in the middle of the night to add wood to her firebox. She had lit her evening fire at 6, using only 10 small splits of dry ash, and let it burn hot and fast for 3 hours to fully charge the stone mass. By 9, she had closed the firebox damper and retired to her alcove, pulling the double pine doors shut behind her. The stone wall, holding more than 140,000 BTUs of stored heat energy, spent the night slowly, quietly releasing its warmth into her sleeping space. While her neighbors were shivering under piles of heavy quilts, Ingeborg lay in her shift, comfortable and undisturbed, listening to the distant roar of the wind against her roof. The stone did not bleed the fire's heat into the ground as Nels had predicted. Instead, her thick fieldstone foundation, insulated from the frozen earth by her gravel drainage bed, acted as a thermal barrier, holding the warmth where it was needed most. She slept through the night, her breath warm and her heart at peace, completely protected by the silent engine of heat she had built with her bare hands. The winter had delivered its verdict, and the stone had answered. While her neighbors were locked in a desperate struggle to keep their air warm, Ingeborg Halvorsen's cabin was demonstrating the quiet power of a physical principle that cold climate civilizations had understood for centuries. It was the principle of thermal mass, the capacity of dense material to store heat and release it slowly over time. The fire Ingeborg burned in her small firebox was not meant to warm the air in her room. Its sole purpose was to drive heat into the 9,500 pounds of river stone and clay mortar that surrounded her sleeping alcove. Air has almost no heat capacity, but stone is a thermal sponge, absorbing energy and holding it with a patient, unyielding tenacity. What Ingeborg had built was a functional synthesis of a global tradition that had been independently discovered by cultures throughout the northern latitudes of the world. In the frozen steppes of Siberia and across the Russian heartland, families had survived for generations by sleeping on the pechka, the massive brick stoves that occupied a quarter of their living space, heating their bodies directly through the masonry rather than wasting wood to heat drafty air. In the northern provinces of China, where winter was a relentless enemy, families lay in comfort on the raised brick and clay sleeping platforms connected directly to their kitchen flues, absorbing the heat of their cooking fires and releasing it steadily through the night. Even the indigenous Yupik of the far north had survived without firewood by building semi-subterranean sod houses, the Times Ina Times and Times Kaskik Times, which used the insulating mass of the earth and the heat of the 40 and semi-subterranean, their own bodies to maintain stable, livable temperatures through the worst of the Arctic winter. These civilizations, separated by oceans and centuries, had all arrived at the same correct answer to the problem of cold. They knew that the fire's job was to heat the stone, and the stone's job was to heat the body. Sigrid had not read their histories, but she carried their collective wisdom in her grandmother's memory. The sleeping alcove inside her stove wall was a masterclass in passive design. The 3 stone walls enclosing her bed, the back, the top, and the bottom platform were all connected directly to the same thermal mass as her firebox. The stone, heated to temperatures between 90 and 110 degrees during her evening fire, spent the next 12 hours radiating that warmth directly into the small, enclosed sleeping space. By closing the double pine doors, she was trapping that heat within a volume of only 30 cubic feet, creating a microenvironment that remained at a constant, comfortable 70 degrees through the night. The half-inch gap she had carved at the base of the doors allowed a slow, passive air exchange, drawing fresh, cool air in along the floor and venting warmer, exhaled air out through the top, preventing the accumulation of carbon dioxide without creating drafts. It was a self-regulating, passive climate control system that required no fuel, no electricity, and no maintenance. While Jonas Lind and Marta Vang burned through their firewood reserves to heat air that escaped through their walls, Ingeborg's cabin was operating on less than a third of their fuel consumption. She had turned the very bones of the earth into a sanctuary, and the stone was keeping her safe. On the morning of the 6th day of the blizzard, Jonas Lind decided he could no longer sit by and let the Norwegian widow freeze to death in her bedroomless cabin. He pulled on his heavy wool coat, wrapped a scarf around his face until only his eyes were visible, and stepped out into the killing 30 below zero cold. The snow was packed solid by the wind, and it took him nearly an hour of hard, lung-burning effort to struggle through the waist-deep drifts to Ingeborg's claim. He fully expected to find a frozen chimney and a silent, cold house. He expected to find her huddled near a dead fire, or worse, succumbing to the frostbite that had already claimed several of his neighbors' livestock. But as he approached the cabin, he noticed something that made him stop. The chimney was venting a thin, steady stream of gray smoke, not the thick, desperate plume of a roaring fire, but the quiet, slow-burning draft of a system that was resting. He walked to the door and knocked, his wooden mitts thudding against the pine planks. A moment later, the door opened. Jonas stood frozen in his tracks, his eyes wide with disbelief. Ingeborg Halvorsen stood in the doorway, dressed only in a light wool kirtle and a simple linen apron. No coat, no shawl, no heavy blankets wrapped around her shoulders. Her face was not pinched with cold, her hands were not shaking, and behind her, the interior of her cabin felt warm and comfortable, like a spring afternoon. "Come in, Jonas," she said, her voice calm and steady. "You must be cold." Jonas stepped through the doorway, his boots dripping snow onto her clean pine floorboards, and pulled off his wool scarf. The air inside the cabin read 62 degrees on her wall thermometer. The room was warm, actually warm, with none of the drafty chill that scoured his own home. He looked around the single, tidy room, his eyes fixing on the massive stone stove wall that dominated the space. The firebox was cold, containing only a handful of gray ash from her morning birch splits. "How?" Jonas managed, his voice hoarse from the cold. "Your stove is out? Your fireplace is cold? How is it warm in here?" Ingeborg smiled, walked to the eastern face of the massive limestone wall, and opened the double pine doors she had mortised into the stone. Jonas stepped closer, peering into the opening, and felt a wave of gentle, radiant heat roll out into his face. Inside the alcove, he saw her bed a simple mattress of wool, and clean linen laid directly onto the stone platform, surrounded on 3 sides by dense, heat-holding river stone. The limestone, still warm to the touch 12 hours after her last fire had died, was quietly, steadily, releasing its stored thermal energy into the sleeping space. "My bed is inside the stove wall," Ingeborg explained, placing her hand flat against the warm stone. "The stone remembers the heat, Jonas. It holds it through the night, and it keeps me warm while the room cools." Jonas stood silent, his professional pride completely shattered by the simplicity of what he was seeing. He touched the stone wall himself, feeling the gentle, living warmth push back against his hand. He looked at the double pine doors, then at her small firebox, and finally back at Ingeborg. He realized then that she had not built a tomb, nor had she made a mistake. She had built a sanctuary, a perfectly designed engine of survival that outperformed his finest carpentry using a fraction of the fuel. The laughter of the settlement was gone, replaced by a silent, humbling truth. The silence inside Ingeborg's cabin was filled with the quiet crackle of the cooling stone, but to Jonas Lind, it was the loudest sound he had ever heard. He looked at his raw, calloused hands, then at her warm limestone wall, and felt the heavy weight of his own arrogance slip away. He had spent months mocking her, telling the settlement that she was mad, and predicting her death. But here she stood, safe, warm, and dignified, while his own family was shivering in a cabin he had built with his best tools. "Ingeborg," Jonas said quietly, his voice trembling slightly, "I owe you an apology. We all do. We thought you were foolish because you did not build like us, but you were the only one who truly understood what the winter could do. You built a sanctuary, and I called it a mistake." Ingeborg reached out and placed a warm hand on his arm, her eyes soft with forgiveness. "You do not need to apologize, Jonas," she said. "You built what you knew, but I had to build what I remembered. My family in Wisconsin died because our home could not hold the heat, and I promised myself that would never happen again." Jonas Lind returned to the settlement that afternoon, his pride completely gone, and told everyone what he had seen. The news spread through Pine Ridge like a Chinook wind, thawing their skepticism and replacing it with a deep, quiet respect. Marta Vang stopped her gossiping and was the first to bring Ingeborg a loaf of fresh bread, her face soft with a silent, humbled gratitude. Within a week, the men who had laughed at her cabin were standing in her single room, notebooks in hand, asking for her measurements and her clay sand horsehair mortar recipe. They wanted to know how to fit the pine doors, how to design the horizontal flue channels, and how to select the dense river schist from the creek. Ingeborg shared her knowledge freely, showing them how the mass of the earth could be captured to protect their children from the cold. In the summers that followed, the architecture of Pine Ridge transformed. Guided by Ingeborg's memory and Jonas Lind's carpentry skills, the settlers began retrofitting their cabins with heavy internal stone cores, building warming walls that stored heat and kept their families safe through the long winter nights. The settlement never experienced another tragedy like the freeze of 1883. The childhood coughs that frontier mothers feared began to fade, replaced by the deep, healthy sleep of children resting against warm masonry. Ingeborg lived in her tiny, bedroomless cabin for another 40 years, watching her neighbors' families grow and prosper. Her home remained a legendary sanctuary of warmth and comfort, a place where winter was something that happened outside, never inside. Decades later, long after the frontier had yielded to modern towns and central heating systems, her stone-walled cabin still stood as a historic landmark, a simple, powerful monument to the strength of a mother's memory, the silent, enduring wisdom of the stone, and the triumph of practical truth over pride. If this story of Ingeborg's quiet victory over the Dakota cold and her neighbors' doubts touched you, please hit that like button to support our channel. It helps us bring you more of these inspiring, forgotten survival secrets from the courageous people who settled the American frontier. Subscribe to our channel to make sure you never miss an episode of our weekly historical journeys. We are dedicated to uncovering the real, practical wisdom of the past wisdom that was paid for with survival and is still true today. Drop a comment below with your location and the coldest winter you have ever faced. We read every single comment, and we would love to know how Ingeborg's warmth is landing with you today. Thank you for watching, and stay safe.